All right, so my name's Jesse Sanders. I am the CEO of a company called Breebug. I'm just flew in today from Denver, Colorado, and I tend to travel quite a bit and speak and talk about topics that I'm passionate about. So tonight we're going to talk about end-to-end testing. Does anybody know what end-to-end testing is? Okay, so with those people that do know what it is, who likes end-to-end testing? So okay, at best we have a. So we're going to talk about end-to-end testing, and I've been working with end-to-end testing for, I think since about 2009, and we'll talk about some of the ins and outs and what things go well and what some of the really big pitfalls are. So before we get going, who am I? This is a really cool picture. I was just out in Toronto at Google's site it's right next to Waterloo. And they had an artist out there drawing stuff, and so I thought this was kind of cute. I like to ride bicycles a lot, and between road biking and mountain biking. But I'm a Google developer expert, otherwise known as a GDE. I specialize in web technologies, and what I like to do is travel the country and talk to people about different web technologies, in particular Angular, and also with enterprise patterns. However, since this group is more of a broad JavaScript group, I decided that I was going to kind of venture outside and create a new presentation that wasn't about NGRX and Angular and enterprise applications, but something that might apply to what you guys are looking at every day today. And so one of the really big topics that I like is Cypress. Recently, I was in New York, I believe it was back in May, and a friend of mine, or now a friend of mine, this gentleman named Gleb, came up. He works for the Cypress team, and he presented at the Google office in New York City and talked about Cypress, and I got really, really interested because it made some promises about technology and how to change how we do end-to-end testing that made me come back around. Okay, so bottom line is that end-to-end testing is hard. It's not an easy thing to do. A lot of times it starts out pretty easy. We think about, we want to be able to test our application. Like everyone does unit tests, right? Do you guys know how to write unit tests? They taught you guys yet how to do unit tests yet? No? All right, so that's coming. That should be coming very, very soon. You should be learning about that. And unit tests are great because that allows me to test an individual function. Now, if that function happens to call a service, we can mock out that service and we can just test what does that function do and does it operate properly. So that's great. But at the end of the day, what we really want to be able to do is test it in the browser. How does our application respond in a browser? And how does it respond in each browser? Because they don't always respond quite the same exact way, as a lot of you probably already know, and some of you will be learning soon. So end-to-end testing is hard. One of the big problems here is that they usually take way too long to run. And the more tests I write, the longer it takes. And when I say a long time, like where a lot of times with unit tests, we can run those in anywhere from a couple of seconds to a couple of minutes. End-to-end testing can be from a half hour to 4 or 5 hours to get through all the end-to-end tests. And so it takes far too long to run. Why is this a problem? Well, the problem is when I go to check in my code and when we go to do the end-to-end tests, often they're run in the middle of the night. And when they fail, and they fail intermittently, by the way, that's another problem. But when they fail, I don't associate it back to my code. Must have been your code that made them fail. Or it must just be an intermittent problem, okay? So because of this when they fail intermittently, they're flaky, one day the same test has been passing for months. There's been no changes in that functional area, and then all of a sudden it just starts failing for no reason. That's what we talk about with flaky, and that's where people start to lose interest in developing these kind of tests. Then we get into timing issues. So kind of the problem with the testing tools that we have available historically is that we're dealing with a slice of time. I was listening to the gentleman that actually wrote Cypress IO. I was listening to that this morning, kind of thinking about other things I could bring to this, and he basically brought it out in a really interesting way. He described it as, imagine being in a field where it's completely pitch black and you cannot see anything. There's stuff around you, and so you light off a firework, and boom, it explodes, and all of a sudden I can see, okay, this is where everything's at. And all you're getting is just that instant little snapshot of in that period of time of how the state is around you. And the problem with that is that stuff isn't loaded by the time I need it or when I think. And then I start to see developers do really bad things. They'll start to use things like set timeout, and they'll try to do really weird things to deal with the asynchronous nature of the web. And eventually what happens is, because it's so hard, developers give up. And or we still have 1,000 tests, but we don't really care what the results are anymore. And we could just kind of take those end-to-end tests and we're like, that was a really great idea, Bob, but we just don't run them anymore. There's just no value. If they're failing intermittently, they take too long to run, we've got all these timing issues, what's the point? So the test tools that I'm talking about, who's worked with Selenium before? Okay, so I was introduced to Selenium in about 2009 when I was working on the .NET framework, and it was cutting edge. Like, there was nothing else out there like this that could do what we could do with Selenium. And then Selenium merged with WebDriver, and it became Selenium WebDriver, and then eventually it's now just, I think, WebDriver. And there's some other tools like Protractor. So if you're in the Angular world, they built a framework on top of WebDriver that basically works with the digest mode within Angular, so that it should help cure some of these timing issues. No, it didn't cure the timing issues. They're still really slow, and they still fail intermittently. And honestly, the biggest offender is Internet Explorer. So that's the one that we'd always spend the most time, and the tests would just continually fail because of timing issues. But there's other ones out there as well, like Nightwatch. Anybody work with Nightwatch at all? Heard of it? Okay, yeah. There's some other ones out there. These are actually all built upon the Selenium framework. Okay, so they're just different flavors of Selenium, if you will, different little adapters for them, different kind of ways of dealing with it, but they're ultimately Selenium at the core. So part of the problem here since about 2009 is that web applications have evolved a lot. Okay, so the days of just doing server-side rendering and me filling out a form and then clicking submit and the whole form goes away, and it comes back and says, by the way, you missed these fields, and the validation fires, it's not local, it's going to the server, coming back. So we had the full page refreshes. Every time we do something, it's going and getting a new page and responding to whatever it is that we're doing for our interaction. And then we had things like Ajax. Anybody work with Ajax? Yeah, that was fun, right? I mean, that was cutting edge. I can remember the first time I looked at Ajax and what's this $sign thing? I don't really understand. But it really helped us solve a full page refresh issue that we were having that was causing a big complaint with our clients. And so that's, jQuery. It's part of, Ajax was built into jQuery. There are other ways of doing Ajax as well. And where things have kind of evolved into now is client-side MVCs. So whether you're dealing with Backbone, Ember, React, Angular, Vue, we're dealing with some sort of Vue engine at the lowest level that is now taking over on the client side and requesting data and bringing it back. And now we have even more asynchronous operations. And that's where things get a lot more tricky, and where products like Selenium and Selenium-based products just don't work as well. So the challenge is, basically we're firing off, as I kind of described with the whole fireworks thing, we're firing off commands saying, okay, go find this element. Go request this page, go find this element, and it should have this class applied to it. And there are these little black box commands attempting to then find that in some snapshot of time. And the problem is that because of these timing issues and it's not there when we expect it, and it may not show up for a little bit, then we have failures and they're intermittent, and it's just a pain. Who's ever dealt with like magic data or seed data, right? That's a job in itself. So either you have to go create a database full of data just for testing, and then every time you run the tests, you have to basically dump the database, get the new database, the seed database, drop that in there, and make sure it's all fresh, and now we can run tests against that. Or the other really common way that we'd see it is this magic data thing, where I have an edge case and I need to find a customer that's ordered this type of product in the last X number of months, so I can test this page and make sure that it renders these special conditions that way. So then I end up going and creating the customer or finding a customer, creating the order with that exact product, and I have to actually have that be part of the process. And so my tests actually double, triple, quadruple in size. I'm no longer testing the application. I'm creating data to then turn around to go locate it and test and make sure that it's going to show up that way. Not a real good way of doing things. As I mentioned before, the other big challenge here is speed. If the tests are slow and I'm not able to find out what the results are, am I really going to depend on the results? Am I going to wait 8 hours to submit my PR? Maybe not. In a very dynamic team, they usually don't wait for that kind of thing. The other big challenge here is that there's no dev tools during the tests. So when it does break and you're trying to figure out what went wrong, you go to open up the dev tools and then you get a new error that says, hey, by the way, dev tools are being used right now by Selenium. You can't use it. So you're basically hopping on one foot to a minefield. Not a real ideal way of doing things. And then the other real problem and challenge here is cryptic errors. So you get these stack traces, and you're trying to go, it's usually element not found, and timeout has occurred, and it's like, well, which element? It doesn't even tell me which element. So then I'm trying to figure out, based off the stack trace, which element is it that it didn't find, and at what point, and why, and what things have occurred before then. So we start to create like these logs or some way that we can track. It becomes quite challenging. So, I meant to change this slide. Actually, I didn't. End-to-end testing sucks. It's hard. It's a pain. And most teams that I see anymore, and historically what I tell teams is this: don't waste your time writing end-to-end tests. If they're not going to be reliable and you're not going to depend on them and they're not going to be something that's going to be of real value to the organization, don't do it. It's not worth it. Write a couple end-to-end tests. Use them as a smoke test. All happy path. Log in, go from page to page to page, and make sure that I don't get any errors, nothing, I don't see any pop-ups of anything bad, and we're going to just really do a smoke test to make sure all of our integration points. And that's where most people go to with these types of tests. Because if they're not reliable, that's about the best I'm going to get out of them, and have some sort of reliability. All right, so let's talk about Cypress. Cypress changes everything. All the things that we just talked about, the challenges, all the things that don't work well, Cypress was actually built to address. Cypress is built using JavaScript. And so since it's running client-side and it's directly in the browser, it tends to work a lot better. Number one thing, the number one goal for it was easy setup. So it's not difficult to bring into a project. You don't even have to bring it into a project. You can create a separate project that's just your Cypress tests. It's really up to you on how you want to do it. And then how we write tests is very simple. If you've done Selenium tests, these are going to seem natural to you. Most of the commands are fairly similar to what you're used to with some sort of Selenium-based tool. They're easy to run tests. The tests aren't difficult to run. They run quickly, or they can run quickly if we do a few things. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the tests are easy to run. They're easy to reconfigure. I can have them be set up to run for my local dev environment. And then when I need to change it so that I'm running it in test, stage, or production, I can have them easily reconfigured to point to those, and I don't have to manage big configs and making things messy. They're easy to debug on the tests. As we kind of dig in here, I'm going to show you how we can kind of step through. We can look at each step and be able to kind of time travel, if you will, between tests and be able to see actually what happened, what's happening during the test. So this is very powerful. The other thing that's available to us is that like the Chrome Dev Tools, those are available. We can, if we're trying to figure out what element we want to select, I can do that right from within the Dev Tools. I can see, anything that's console logged. I can go select an element. Okay, that's the one I'm looking for. So we have all the tools available to us, and we're not hopping on one leg to a minefield, wondering when our other leg's going to blow off. All right, so setup. Setup is super simple. You can do this in your existing project. So if you have an Angular project, a React project, Vue, whatever, you can do this right in your project. Or if you want, you can just create Cypress tests that are completely separate in another folder, another repo. As long as you have a package JSON, so you can go ahead and do your npm install. The recommendation here is you go ahead and do the npm install of Cypress. Go ahead and save that as a dev dependency. And then it's as simple as running npx Cypress open. Now, this is assuming you have npm 5.2 or greater. If you don't have that, then you just have to be able to run Cypress using node modules and /Cypress/bin, and you can run it that way, right? But most of us should be running on npm at least version 5 and above, 5.2 and above, and so we can use the npx command. All right, so when we run the npx command, this is what comes up. We get a Chrome window here, and it shows us a list of all the specs that are available. And from that, then we can go, you can see there's a button up here in the top right-hand corner. It says Run All Specs, and it will go through and run. Now, what's interesting and what I love about Cypress is when I go ahead and do the install Cypress, and install it, and then do Cypress open, it actually goes ahead and installs and adds these tests to my project. Okay, I have to get an examples folder, and so it gives me a bunch of examples for me to look at. So I don't have to start from scratch if I don't want to. Okay, so from there, this is basically kind of what happens. I got a little GIF here from my video that I created this morning for this, and it starts running those tests. This is only about 6 or 7 seconds long, but you can see it starts to run the test, and I have a couple different panes there that I can look at and get some data from. So the other thing here, so the setup was fairly simple. There's not a whole lot of work to set up Cypress. I can get it into my project very quickly. It'll go ahead and set up a folder structure for me. And now it's like, how do I write tests? How difficult is this going to be? Well, there's tons of examples at the example.cypress.io, and the examples that I was just showing you of it running, that is actually against this website. Okay, so they have tests against that website. You can see all the different ways of being able to iterate over elements, find them, iterate over them, find children, parents, whatnot, and be able to do your assertions against them. So the tests are really simple to write. It basically comes down to, I'm going to visit, where am I going? I'm going to go visit www.google.com. Okay, I'm going to query. I want to find the text box that with an ID of Q, and then I want to do an action. I want to type, and then I can then assert and say should, and what comes back from that. So it's really, really simple. Our actions include, we can type, we can click, we can select, we can focus, we can blur. We can basically do any action that a user can do, with the mouse and the keyboard, but be able to do it all with Cypress. So let's take a look at a test here. This is an example that actually comes out of the examples deal. Let me show you actually really quick here in Visual Studio. So when I bring Cypress into my project, it creates a Cypress folder, and inside of that it creates fixtures, integration, plugins, screenshots, and support. And under integration, it has examples. So inside of here, you can see all the different examples. So if I come over here, that's actually up and running. Let's actually run the command I was talking about before, npx Cypress open. Of course, they said do not live code during any presentation. That's rule number 1. Something inevitably will blow up, right? But so far, we're good here. So you can see we did our npx Cypress open. Let me make that just a touch bigger as we do commands. That'll be easier. Make that a little bigger. Apparently not. All right, so you can see here's a list of all the spec files that it has found under the examples folder. I can go ahead and run those. Again, those directly map back to what's here inside of examples. Action spec, aliasing spec, action spec, aliasing spec. All right, great. So then when I go ahead and run all specs, you can see here it's running the commands over here. All right, come on. Okay, I was having this problem earlier. If I rerun it, bam. So something about closing out this window forces me to stop it and have to rerun it again. I'm not quite sure what the problem there is. But here, it's running through the series of tests. You can see here it's telling me what the total time is, right up there where my cursor's at, how many pass tests I have and how many failed tests I have. So I'm getting instant feedback on that. I can stop these at any time and be able to see, if I want to go ahead and stop them and check on something, I can. So now, you see here I've got a little assertion error that we have some sort of we got a property base URL of null, but we got a base URL. We'll talk about that. That's actually a change that I made and just causing that to fail. But so this over here tells me all the different actions that are occurring and what's happening. Here is my preview. So as I open up this test we want to be able to type into a DOM element. You can see I am, make that bigger? Yeah, I can make that a little bit bigger. Is that better? All right. So you can see here, I'm visiting this site. I'm going to the example Cypress IO, and I am getting a field called action email. And then I want to go ahead and type into it fake email. And then I have an assertion expecting that this element then has a value of fake at email. I can do left and right arrows. I can delete, alt option, a whole bunch of different pieces here. And I can kind of step through step by step, what's occurring here. Same thing on the focus. I can go ahead and get this item. I can focus on it. See how that impacts that element, and then I can expect that element now has a focus class that's been applied to it. So I can go through and check the classes and the properties that have been applied to that element. Okay. So in this case here, this is off the action, and this is the focus one that we were actually just looking at, this test here. So you can see we're doing a visit, and then we're doing a get. We're using a class to go find the action-focus, so the element that has that class on it. We're going to focus on it, and then we're going to assert that it should have a class called focus. And then it's also then going to look at the previous element, and it should have an attribute of style that includes a color of orange. So basically it's saying that when we have focus on that, the element that's outside of that should have a color of orange applied to it. So pretty simple. But allows you to do some pretty dynamic kind of testing and making sure that elements are showing up the right way. All right, so here's another test. This is a little different. I want to give you kind of another example here. This is based on actions. In this case, again, we're going out to our example website, and we are looking for something. We're looking for the query form. And then we can use a command called within. And using within, we can say, I want to find the first input. And I want to assert that it should have an attribute, placeholder, and that placeholder should say email. And the last input should have an attribute of placeholder with a value of password. Okay, so now I can check and make sure that if I'm using placeholders that are going to be displayed in those inputs, that those are actually there and that they're visible to a user and whatnot. All right. So handling errors. We saw a brief example of handling the error, as I've shown you real briefly there, that it had a base URL set that it didn't expect, and that was blowing up. But I got a better example to show you here in just a second. So the main thing about handling errors is that there's no more cryptic errors. You're not having to dig through a stack trace to figure out what went wrong and at what point and why things aren't going well. So the output's super easy to read. It's plain English. It's going to give you really good clues and tell you, like, this is the element I'm trying to find. It's just not there. And also give you some hints about why. So here's a really good example. I've got a test, and I'm trying to visit my home page, which happens to be on localhost 4200. And it says here, we attempted to make a request to this URL, but the request failed without a response. Okay, that's way better than what we typically get from a Selenium-based testing framework, where it's a stack trace and it comes back with something kind of cryptic about unable to get page, and we don't even know which page it is really at this point, and gives us some ideas here. Common situations why this would fail: you don't have internet access, you forgot to run or boot your web server, which was the case for me. Or my web server wasn't accessible, or I decided to go in and set up some sort of proxy configuration that now just pretty much shut down all browser support to be able to get web pages. All right. So often, once we go ahead and install Cypress, what we're going to want to do is go ahead and kill the examples folder. Like, we don't really need that to be part of our project. And we can go out and create this test here. First, we're going to touch to create this homepage spec, and then we're going to go ahead and create a describe. The homepage successfully loads, and we're just going to try to visit at localhost 4200. That's actually the test that I wrote that caused this failure when I went to go run it. So you can see it's pretty simple to do. It's simple to specify, hey, what's my starting point? What page am I going to? Is this my login page or whatnot? And I can start to develop my tests from here. So for me, the solution for this was actually to start the server. In Angular with the CLI, we just run ng-serve, and that goes ahead and serves up our application, and now is available on localhost 4200, and that solved the problem for us. All right, so one of the questions that comes up, and I wanted to address this, is a lot of people have this idea about, let's have Cypress start the server, right? I wouldn't have to do this. This would be really, really simple. No, don't do it. It's a really bad idea. It does not follow best practices. There's some reasons for this. This is considered an anti-pattern. The Cypress execute function, and there's also one called task. They can only run tasks that eventually exit. Okay, and usually when we're serving up a web page, it's not going to terminate automatically. We have to self-terminate that, and so we're going to run into that problem about, okay, is it already running? Okay, shut it down, bring it back up. How do we deal with those scenarios? We also then run into port conflicts. Okay, just a bunch of really bad stuff. The recommendation here is go ahead and start it up on your own. If you're doing it on a CI server and you want to be able to run it there, you're going to first run your ng-serve. You're going to then run your Cypress commands and go ahead and kick off the tests. All right, so let's talk about a few of the Cypress features, and I kind of touched on this a little bit. We had the test status menu. So that's this up here that tells us, hey, we've got 48 tests that passed. We have one that failed. It took 35 seconds to run, which, by the way, for 48 tests to run, that's pretty decent. That's actually some decent speed for these types of UI tests. We're just under 1 second per test. So that's not too bad, especially considering we're pulling up the web page each time to be able to do that test. Okay. So we've got that. Then we've got our command log. This is our command log area here. This tells us every command that it is doing. You know, I'm visiting, I'm getting, I'm typing in it, I'm asserting, I'm typing, I'm asserting, I'm getting, I'm typing, I'm asserting. I can see every single command, what I'm doing. You know, when I look at the get, I can see that I'm attempting to get an element that has a class called action disabled. So it's very clear to me if I have a failure that's happened here, what I'm trying to look for. What it is that was causing the failure, what element's not there for me. Again, in the Selenium world, it's element not found. Here's a line number. Good luck. Hope it works out for you. It's much more difficult. The other one is the app preview. So this is what the app looks like itself over on the right-hand side. So whatever our app is, this is what's going to be being previewed, and you'll actually see it going through the application. So if you have your application where you're logging in, and then you're going to your dashboard, and on your dashboard, you're clicking on the products, and it's taking to a products master page, and you click on a product in the grid, and it takes you to the product edit page. you're going to see each one of those as it goes through here, and then it's going to show up on the right-hand side. And as I step through each one of these actions, you're going to see it progress from page to page. So again, this is how it allows you to time travel and allows you to see what is actually occurring, so it's not just some black box of commands that you're hurling through the night and wondering why it's not working. Let's see here. All right, so one of the other best practice tips, we covered one of them, which was the don't try to start the server using Cypress. That's a really bad anti-pattern. The other one here is to use the Cypress JSON. By default, when you create a Cypress project, it's going to be blank. But one of the things to do is set the base URL. It'll do a couple of things for you. One is when you go ahead and pull up Cypress and you do the npx Cypress open, it will tell you whether or not it's running. Like if it's not running, you'll get this big error message from the get-go, and it'll know that it'll tell you that the server is not running. You can override this, by the way, using the -- config, and then you can set the base URL to whatever you want. There are also some other performance advantages by setting a base URL. You can go out to the documentation, kind of read into that. There was actually a fairly long list of reasons why you'd want to do this, but we won't dig too far into that. So the other nice thing here is it eliminates hard-coded URLs. So the problem here is, let's say you go in and you put in, dev.mywebsite.com, and now you want to change it to run it in test, and then in stage, and then in production. Now we got to come up with some sort of configuration way to be able to override that and plug the new value in, and that all goes away. We can, by just adding the base URL here, I can then override it by saying npx open -- config and set my base URL there. So in this case here, all I'm doing is changing the port number from 4200 to 4300, but that works. One of the things that's interesting that I'll show you, that we're already running our site right now on 4200. So let's go ahead and kill this, and I'm going to paste. What did I do wrong? Oh, there we go. We'll go ahead and run it again. So this is the error message that I wanted you to see. Cypress could not verify that the server set as your base URL is running. So we were able to overwrite it very, very easily. I can now point it at dev, test, stage, production, wherever. My local box, doesn't matter. Very simple to do, and I didn't have to do anything funky to make it happen. Okay, so we'll kill this, and we'll put it, let's just npx Cypress open. All right. So, is that it? Is that all Cypress is really good for? Right? Did I fly all the way from Denver to show you this? Really? No, this is not it. This alone should be some things that would make you want to consider Cypress and maybe go like, hey, you know what? This seems a little better. Just the cryptic error messages alone would be enough to get me to change. I've spent far too many nights digging through stack traces trying to figure out what is wrong. We shouldn't have to do that. The configuration, how easy it is to write the test, being able to step through the test, all those things are great. But to me, that's not enough reason to switch. So where E2E fails is the thing that we kind of touched about it at the beginning, but this whole seed data thing, we didn't solve that with this, did we? That's, to me, the #1 problem with end-to-end tests, is I have to get this seed data, this magic data set up so that I can test all these aspects of my application out. It's the worst. And then we didn't even address the slow thing. So great, I got new tests and I've got a really great way, a better way of writing them and debugging them, but man, if they still take 8 hours to run, what's the point? And if you're not going to use them as a developer to make sure and validate that your code's actually right and it's rendering the correct stuff, then why are you doing it? Don't waste your time, because you're going to throw them away anyway. End-to-end fails because the edge cases is just what drives you nuts, because then you have to figure out, again, all this magic seed data, or you got to go create the data that you need, and there's all these little one-off variances that you need to test. How are you going to do that? So before you know it, you know your tests just are, I mean, they just keep multiplying in length to be able to just test these little variances, because now I have to go either find that data that already exists in the seed or go create it so I can find it and then test it. So I think we pretty much covered all this. The main thing on this magic data is because of all this stuff, it creates fragile tests. And fragile tests mean that they're not dependable, and you'll stop believing in them, and you won't use them. So, and this can be also on the, if you're using a seed database, is that the seed changes or it doesn't get updated correctly, or you have an old database that's been modified and it won't work for your tests. So this is the one reason why I think you should consider using Cypress. So introducing stubbed responses. When I heard about this like blew my mind. When Gleb, I'm in New York, I'm sitting there just like you, sitting in your seat, and he says, yeah, man, you could stub what the server sends back. I was like, what? You can stub what it's returning. And then I thought about it. I was like, well, it's JavaScript. It could intercept. You know, we can write interceptors right now in JavaScript to go ahead and intercept calls, and say, hey, if the browser is making a request to go get from this path, return this instead. You know, we do this with mocks all the time for unit testing. So this is recommended for most tests. In fact, I would actually say, with an asterisk, all tests should be stubbed. The asterisk is you should have one true end-to-end test and stub the rest. Okay, so if you can prove that your integration points work, and I can load data, I can go to the products form and I can see a list of products, I can select the product and it can load it into the product page for editing, that's good enough. I've tested my backend API, I've checked my integration points. I'm good enough at that point to go like, hey, from an end-to-end perspective, and testing from the very front end all the way to the back end and making sure that those API calls work, we're probably pretty good. I don't need to have those keep repeating on the tests. So if I do one true end-to-end test and I stub out the rest of the calls, now is where the power happens. So I want you to think about this. When we talked about this, where first we log in. So I have to pull the page up. I log in. I go to the dashboard. How many things load on the average dashboard? I don't know. I'd say maybe 15, 20 calls, right, to go get various pieces of data, because I need some user information, roles information, permissions information. I need to load 10 different components that are on the dashboard page and feed them data. And then I click on something on the products, and then that, so on and so forth. So we have a lot of loads, a lot of things going on. And that all takes time. And that's why our tests get longer and longer and longer, and why it takes 8 hours to sometimes run these. So the tests are way faster. So how much faster? When I stub them out, the default is 20 milliseconds to return. So I don't have to make that round trip. Now, most data calls on a really healthy system local to my desktop, I might be able, on average, let's call it 100 milliseconds. So it's 5 times faster. And that just starts adding up over and over and over again. So the other nice thing here is there's no magic, seed data setup, none of this stuff. I can just actually tell it when I ask for a list of products, give them this list. And I know exactly what's going to be in that list. And then I can click on an item, and when it asks for a product by a given ID, give them this one. So how easy is it to stub? I would say it's very easy to stub. So the first thing we have to do is we have to say, hey, Cypress, I need you to get involved and launch a server. And as a server, you're going to watch for any calls, any route calls that I define to you, and I want you to handle it instead of allowing it to go to the back end. Anything I don't define, go ahead and go to the back end. It's cool, no problem. But anything I do define, I want to have it handled this way. So in my case here, I've defined a route with a method of get. My URL is anything /users, and my response is whatever I want it to be. In my case here, well, let's return an empty array. So stubbing solves a lot of problems because now the tests are super fast because my data calls are super fast. I didn't have to create the magic data, seed data. I get consistent results. It's always going to return the same exact thing, exactly what I told it to return. My end-to-ends can just truly just be smoke tests, and I can make sure my integration points are there, and then I don't have to write a whole bunch of those, right? I can just write one for each basic functional area. But there's more. We can do more with stubbing. So one of the things is, if you think about it, if we had to put inside of the array, hey, here's what I expect for the return, or if I had to even just create a variable at the top of my test that said, hey, here's users, it's of an array, and here's what I want it to be. Well, that becomes a little arduous to maintain over time, and it's hard then to share that across tests. In fact, the most common way is copy, right? Paste in another one, and then the problem is that if I'm using this in multiple areas and we change how users are defined, now I got to go change that in multiple areas to get that all straightened out, right? New nightmare. Duplicated data. So in this case here, I'm going to go ahead and define a route for users, and I'm going to use a slightly different syntax. I'm going to say fixture : users.json. So what this is actually saying is, hey, look for a fixtures folder. And inside the fixtures folder, find a file called users.json and use that as the return. The other way I can do it is I can use the fixture command and define the fixture first and say, hey, I want to define a fixture, use the users.json, so it's going to look in that same folder, find that JSON file, and I want to alias it as users.json. And now I can then define my route and say, Cypress, defining a route for gets. Anything with users / I want you to use the users JSON alias here. Okay? That works beautiful for us. Now I don't have to put this everywhere. I don't have to copy stuff around. I can alias it and just use that one variable name and be able to pull that data in. So imagine, again, what I want you to hear is that now when your application goes and requests the list of users that it's going to display, it's not going to make the call to the server. Cypress is going to interject and say, hey, that's cool. I have a little HTTP interceptor here, and we're going to go ahead and kill that call, and I'm going to return this data back to you instead. Now I have a very controlled environment that's hyper fast. All right. So let's get into a little bit more complicated scenario. Because what I've showed you so far is really simple. But the problem is that there's situations where we don't want to start verifying the page until we make sure a bunch of calls are done. I don't want to start verifying that the dashboard's loaded until the dashboard's loaded. This is a common scenario in Selenium. I will go ahead and say, hey, go to the dashboard. And then I'll be like, all right, so what element am I going to wait for? I got to pick one. And I'll pick an element on the page. I'm like, when that one shows up, everything should be cool. We'll be good to go. But you won't. It'll work for a while, and then something will change. And now that one returns a little faster than one of the other calls, and before you know it, you're starting to make assertions against elements that don't exist, and your test fails intermittently because you didn't expect that data wouldn't be there and it wouldn't render out your component the correct way. So how do we get around that? Well, here we are defining two routes, one for activities, one for messages. I'm defining two different fixtures, activities and messages, and then I'm giving them aliases. So if we scoot that over a little bit. So the as is how we're creating our alias. We have get activities and get messages. So we're going to go ahead and visit our page, and then we have a wait command. This is like the holy grail for complicated pages. I can now say, hey, don't go past this point until we've actually gotten all the data back. Now again, we're stubbing the data, but I want to make sure that the data is back, and if the data is back, now my component will have rendered, and it will be there the way that I expect. So I can wait now and say, I pass wait an array, and I can say wait for get activities and get messages. When those are both complete, now I can say, hey, find the H1, and it should contain the word dashboard. This is super powerful. If you've worked in Selenium, and you've had to deal with these types of issues and trying to figure out what do I wait for, how do I get the page to be fully loaded before I start doing my assertions, like this is the holy grail of waits, because otherwise you're really limited to just waiting for a element to show up before then I go, okay, I think I'm good. And that's what causes our flakiness. So let's show you something really quick here, because we're talking about the fixture piece, and I realized that we didn't actually take a look at fixtures. So under the Cypress folder, we have there we go, that's better, right? Let's get that out of the way. Under there, I've got fixtures, and you see I have an example JSON. I have a profile JSON. I have a users JSON. So the users one is probably going to look a little bit more like what you're thinking. It's an array. It's got nested object here. So fairly complicated object for our user. It's got its address, phone, company information, whatnot. So you can see I can do quite a bit with this. Any data that I want to be able to duplicate, the way that I do this, what I'm doing it is I'll actually go into using the dev tools. I'll go ahead and get to that page, and I'll open up the response, take a look at the raw JSON, grab it, paste it in here, and VS Code will automatically format it into really nice JSON for me, and I'm done. I don't have to worry about whether or not it's successfully making that call in the timely manner every single time. Now I get my data back in 20 milliseconds. By the way, you can also set that. You don't have to accept the 20 millisecond default. You can make it slightly faster, slightly slower. It's really up to you on what you want to test. So you have a lot of control there. All right, so waiting for calls to return. This is big. This is a great way for us to make sure that our page is fully set up before we start doing our assertions, and this will help us with reducing, and actually not even reducing, this will help us eliminate flaky tests. I know that data is loaded. I don't have to depend on one single element being there in some way for me to now start checking. All right, so let's talk about another situation here that's, I think, fairly accurate. When we talk about like autocompletes are a little bit more complicated, okay? Because now what I want to do is I first want to create a route for when I go to do my search. And when I do my search, I want it to return a couple of items. So I'm returning two different books in this case. I'm creating my alias here to be get search. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get my autocomplete. So that is I would assume it's an input, but it's anything with an ID of autocomplete. And I'm going to type into it the word book. This then would be firing the autocomplete to go do the search and then bring back a list of stuff. Cypress is going to go ahead and intercept that based off this route that's been defined, and it's going to return this array. Again, this could be a JSON file, whatnot, just for the simplicity of this example. I just left it the way it is. So now I can wait for this to complete. So I can wait for the call to come back. I now have data, and then I can check to see that its URL should include, and it should look like this. So I can verify the URL that I was actually using to go query the database. So this is super powerful because a lot of times we're wanting to verify and make sure that the query string parameters match up with what we think it's supposed to be doing. Because if we're building the URL incorrectly and it's bringing back bogus results, that doesn't really help us, right? We want to be able to validate that. And so then once this is all complete, it's completed, we can check the URL, and now I can get the results and basically say that it should contain book 1 and it should contain book 2. So now I can actually verify the results that have come back, and that I'm rendering onto my page the books that we were given. All right, so in summary, covered a lot of stuff here tonight. We didn't really dig too much into all the commands because I think for most people, the commands are going to be pretty natural. They're really not very complicated. It's mostly exactly what we talked about in the very beginning, which it's visit, it's get. So we're going to get an element, and then we're going to perform some sort of action. We're going to touch it. We're going to focus on it. We're going to type in it. We're going to select it. We're going to click it. all pretty basic stuff. And then we're going to do assertions against it. The really powerful thing here is that UI tests can be dependable if they're written correctly, if we have the right tools. I don't think those tools are Selenium anymore. I think those days have passed. It's a great tool for its time, but it's time for it to move on. E2E in small amounts is okay. When I say E2E, I mean true E2E, from the very web page all the way to the back end and loading all the data loads in between. Having some nice smoke tests is something that I recommend in every application, because when we go to deploy something, as it goes to each environment, I really want to be able to validate that all the integration points are working, and that's very valuable. Otherwise, somebody's got to go manually do it, right, and verify that this is working. Stubbing's the way to go. You can do so much with stubbing. You can have great performance. These tests will run in lightning speed. You'll get instant feedback on whether or not your change is breaking the application. And complex interactions can be manageable. They don't have to be, deal breakers where you're like, yeah, there's no real good way to test this because I can't make sure that we got the data back in time, and it's this timing issue, and I try to set timeout, and that's not working. And, we can manage all that. One of the things that my friend Gleb talked about is, you guys ever seen the triangle when it talks about tests? And at the base of the triangle, it's unit tests. Okay, and that's the majority of your tests. And then you might have some like component tests where you're just testing components in isolation on the HTML page. And then up at the very top of the peak, you'd have end-to-end tests. Well, his suggestion actually was flip it upside down. That your unit tests are the little itty bitty deal, and that your majority of your tests are actually end-to-end and using these mocks, that you'll actually get more value out of it. And the more I use this and the more I bring it into projects and we use this with our enterprise clients, I agree. This is the way to go. Much better reliability. We're able to test it across browsers and make sure it's doing exactly what we want. So with that, really quick, Breebug. We're located in Denver, Colorado. We're a consultancy. We do a lot of architecture reviews, customized training. I'm actually flying to Salt Lake City on Monday to is anybody going to the Framework Summit in Salt Lake City? Anybody? No? Anybody heard? If anybody's interested, by the way, I have half-price coupons for it if you want to go. It gets the price down really, really low. It's out in Park City, actually, so just outside of Salt Lake, and a really fun area. So the other thing we do Angular consulting and staff augmentation, primarily in the Angular space, and especially with large enterprise systems using libraries like NGRX to do Redux patterns. If you want to learn a little bit more about this, or if you'd like to get a copy of the slides, you can reach out to me. My Twitter handle is jesse_Breebug. I will post out to that for these slides, so they'll be available to you. I'll probably be adding a repo to this a little bit later that'll have some of these examples and further this, talk a little bit more, so those will be available through my Twitter handle. You can also email me. This is my real email address, and I always respond to everybody that emails me, as long as you're not spamming me for some multi-level marketing deal. I'm usually pretty good about replying. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. Does anybody have any questions for me before we end? Yes, go ahead.
I was Googling how Cypress handles ES6 plus fetch requests and such, and it looks like currently you have to do some workarounds to get that to work. So if you're using something like Apollo with GraphQL, which defaults to fetch, there's some additional configuration you have to perform. Have you worked much with messing with that? Is it a lot of work? I was just skimming over.
Yeah, I really have not. And the reason being is because in Angular we're using TypeScript, and it's not transpiling down to ES6. ES6 is not widely supported, and thus we don't really deal with that. So we mostly, we're just dealing with TypeScript going down, whatever it's transpiling down to, and we're not seeing that. So in the case if you're writing for ES6 and you want to be able to do that, then you just need to go ahead and basically do that. What's essentially a polyfill to how you handle a fetch command, right?
Yeah, it looks like the polyfill itself doesn't work. You have to like delete the window.fetch object so that Apollo defaults to an XHR request. So it's just some additional configuration you have to perform. I didn't read through the whole thread, but yeah, there's just a GitHub issue open on it, so there's probably clear instructions available.
Sure. Yeah, it's not just something I haven't ran into. All right, great question, by the way. Yeah.
We use GraphQL for our API.
Okay.
So we don't have different RESTful routes for the data.
Okay.
Everything just goes through /GraphQL/API, whatever. Is there a solution for stubbing out the response to that, given that you don't know what data is being returned until you get the query object that's coming through?
Sure. That's a good question. I have not attempted to use this on a GraphQL system. I think there's probably an open issue or someone's already tackled this, but I believe you'd be able to create a custom route for each one of those that would get you close enough to it that would be able to match and bring back the data that you want, but not 100% sure on that with how you make that work with GraphQL. Because I get the query string isn't quite the same. It's definitely different. All right.
Kind of one thing related to that, we're using Salesforce remote actions that we're stubbing out. And one thing that you can do that we're trying to do, I'm not sure if this is the right approach or not, but the remote action is like something that's available in the global context on the page. There's like a window dot something, and Cypress lets us basically override that with whatever we want. So we can just, if you expose something like an escape hash to whatever, remote action that you're looking for, you can just override that in Cypress or do whatever you want. So, if you have something really specific, like maybe GraphQL, you can put something in your application that allows you to hook into that if you wanted to.
Sure, that's a great thing. And I know that, based on what you're saying there, I'm not that familiar with Salesforce and I don't do a lot with it, but being able to do that override's great. I'm not sure that would really apply to what you're doing or trying to do with it. Ideally, we want to still have it go through our code as much as possible, right? We want to intercept it at the last possible point, which is what I think is really great about being able to define those routes and be able to say, hey, when you get this request, go ahead and say, that's great, but here's your data, and be able to intercept it at that point. But in some cases, that's the best that you can do, and you find that point. I will actually do some research on the GraphQL, and I'll get you an answer back on that, and I'll post that also on my Twitter. So, yep.
Have you tried running Cypress headless at all?
I have not tried to run it headless. No. In large part, we're running it using Chrome and doing it that way.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm asking is, the scenario where I have multiple kinds of tests running with different frameworks, having them all sort of run from the console and then standard error or whatever, exit.
Yep.
Or a failed test suite. Is there some sort of mechanism?
I believe there's a mechanism for that. I can get you that answer as well. Yeah. All right.
So we recently rewrote our tests in Test Cafe, and so it uses kind of the strategy of instead of saying, okay, wait for these API requests to finish, just check to see your expectation, like 4 or 5 times. It kind of pulls and sees like, okay, is it this way now? Okay, how about now? How about now? And then after like a full second, it'll say, all right, it failed. Do you have any thoughts about kind of the difference between those paradigms?
Yeah, to me, that's more the paradigm from Selenium. I'm not a fan of that because we never know when it's going to show up. So then we start to build, with Selenium and WebDriver, I can remember we spent a lot of time writing custom wait routines to try to figure out when's the proper time to start, doing my assertions and figuring out whether or not things are loaded correctly. That's the stuff I don't want to do anymore. I really want it to be based off, hey, when I have data and I can stub these out, that now I can just go, right? So I think that's a challenge. And with that type of, Test Cafe, Selenium, WebDriver, Protractor, Nightwatch, any of those, it's all the same problem because you're basically doing exactly what you described right there, is that we're having to create a wait, and they have built-in wait methods in them already, and we say, hey, I want to wait for this element. But then a lot of times we ended up having to write kind of custom ones that would handle different scenarios of wait. Again, I think those days have passed. I don't think that's the best way to do it. It's much better to say, hey, when all of these HTTP requests have been resolved, now I want to go ahead and start my assertions.
Is there anything built in, because you may have to wait for the data to resolve, but you may also need to wait for a full re-render of the page. Is there anything that guarantees that that'll also be done before it starts trying to interact?
Repeat the question again.
So I mean, like if I made an API request,
Okay.
there's also a possibility that I've got 2 seconds worth of React re-rendering or something to do. Is there anything built in that handles properly waiting for the right read?
That's a good question. I've never seen anything that's taken a couple of seconds to re-render. In person, yeah. I mean that might be another. That'd be a bad app, right? So you might have some other problems going on. In my experience, is that with our use of it, when we wait for that data to come back and that's been fully resolved, that it's already there. We've never had a problem where it's like, oh, and now it's not. So the data is resolved, but the component's still not there. So in the case where if you had a component that wasn't rendering, I think that would probably be an indicator to me, at least, of like wondering what's causing this problem. Shouldn't take 2 seconds to do a render of data, right? But again, kind of hit and miss on that. All right, we had a question over here, and we'll come back over here. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a quick question. During your presentation, you said that it's an anti-pattern to have Cypress start the server,
Yes.
but then when you did the stubbing, you had Cypress start the server. So I was wondering, why would you do it?
Different server.
It's a different server.
Different server.
Okay.
It's starting the Cypress server, not starting the server for your application.
Okay.
Okay, so slightly different there. So in Angular, that would be, trying to get Cypress to execute a command called ng-serve, okay, which would then serve up my application. Now the problem with that is, like I said earlier, there's port problems. Is it already running? Do I need to shut it down? Those sorts of things. And so it's considered an anti-pattern to do that. But the Cypress server is saying, hey, I need you to start listening to what the HTTP traffic is, because I'm going to define some routes. And I want you to watch for routes, and when I match, I want you to handle it like this.
All right.
So slightly different. Does that answer your question?
That was it. I
Excellent.
missed something. I wasn't sure.
All right.
Kind of related to the previous question, one thing that we have noticed is that when you call like a side.get, it'll wait for that element to become visible or interactive too. So like in the case where you have a React render that's taking a while, it will actually wait for that element to become interactive before it moves on to that step.
That's a good point. I forgot about that.
It's like a guard, so you don't have to wait a certain amount of time for that re-render to happen. It will eventually time out, but it kind of is built-in way too.
Very good point.
How does it do that behind the scenes? Because that just sounds like that.
It's basically doing a wait, but at this point, it's already got all the data. Assuming I've actually done routes and I've stubbed out each of the calls that the page is doing, then in theory it has all the data, and it really should. Let's say you have a component that takes 2 seconds to render, that within I think it'll probably give it up to like 10 to 30 seconds. I think it's configurable as well for how long it waits. I know the default for Selenium I think was 30 seconds. I think in Cypress it might be closer to 10, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But that would be enough time for it to render and be there. Otherwise, at that point, we can pretty much assume it's not going to render after 10 seconds. So, you had a question, sir?
Yeah. How's drag and drop?
Pardon me?
How's drag and drop?
Drag and drop. Yes, I've actually seen some examples on this. I have not personally written any, but I believe there are. Let's go to the integrations. They don't have drag and drop in the integrations. I've heard that it's good, but I haven't done it. So your mileage may vary.
Huh?
Your mileage may vary. I'm not sure. All right. Any other questions? All right. Before I get out of here tonight as well, I brought a little bit of swag, so I brought some T-shirts out, and I know we had some people ask some questions. And so, if you like the Space Invaders theme, this was a custom T-shirt that we created. We recently held a conference called Angular Denver the first week of August. We had 12 speakers come out. It was a great event, and this was a custom shirt that we had developed. It's got the Breebug logo and the Angular Denver logo on it. What size of shirt you wear, sir? We got larges. All right. You want the Space Invaders? Or I also have one. This is another one of my favorites. Says support local software. So, which one you want? All right. So here's a large. All right. Who else asked questions? All right. So I've got a large. Or do I have? I got one more. Yeah, I got an extra large and two larges in these, or I believe I've got one more of these, which is a extra large.
So, funny story. My work also, for once, had free T-shirts. This almost never happens, and all they had were large, extra large, and 3XL.
I was going to make a joke that, hey, only people that wear either large or extra large can ask questions tonight. because literally I was on my way to driving to the airport, and I'm supposed to be there by, well, my flight leaves at 10:30, and at 9:15 I'm 45 minutes away from the airport, and I'm stopping by my office to pick up T-shirts. And literally my assistant comes running out, tosses them in a car, and I'm out. So
I'll take a large. It's just going to be my sleeping time.
Perfect. There you go.
Thank you.
All right. How about you?
Large Space Invaders.
Large Space Invaders. All right. There you go.
Ordering an extra pizza.
Perfect. All right. So I got two XLs. I have an XL in this and an XL in this. All right.
Local software.
You'll do the local software. All right. There you go. Oh, and there you go. All right. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for allowing me to come out and speak with you tonight. If you have more questions on this, feel free to email me. I mean this seriously. I went out to Tel Aviv and spoke this summer, and I get emails from Tel Aviv asking me NGRX questions all the time. I'm happy to answer them and do what I can to help you out or put you in connection with somebody over at the Cypress team if I'm not able to help you. So with that, yeah, thanks everybody.
All right, I think that's it.